Now turning to our panelist at the end, Ian.
Okay.
The end of the
On the extreme left.
We're skipping Richard. Anyway, our next panelist is Ian Williams.
Okay, that was almost unexpected to listen.
Your mic here.
Yes, I suppose with the, otherwise I'd have no difficulty with being heard on my ear. Is that on? Yes, it is indeed. You know, I always think about the UN the same way that Churchill, who I don't often quote, he's very quotable, but I don't often agree with his quotes. One of the things he said about democracy was it was the worst possible system except all the alternatives. And that's very much how I feel about the UN. I mean, you know, hey, you want knocking stories on the UN? I love them. You know, Perez de Cuellar was once asked, how many people work at the UN? And he paused. This is one of the few witty sayings that ever occurred to him. Oh, about half, he said. Which I suspect is a bit of an exaggeration according to some of the people I know there. But it's still, the point about the UN is it exists as a catalyst. And I look at it and the way it's regarded, for a start, in the UN, in the US, ever since I came here in 1989, the default mode of treating with the UN has been sneeringly dismissive. From left to right. That's how people talk about the UN. It's how they think about it. They wash their hands of it. And I think it was very instructive to contrast the obituaries for Boutros Ghali with what was said about him while he was alive and in office. This revered elder statesman who did so much, who contributed so much, and he spent 5 years being reviled by the whole political and foreign policy establishment. And, you know, we discovered he did have hidden depth, and he was arrogant, and he had lots of problems, but he was also very acute, and he produced a lot of innovations within the UN. But he had to wait until he popped his clogs, as we say in the north of England, for anyone to notice this. I mean, at the same time, I mean, I'm sorry, Stephen, I do think that Ban Ki-moon is a much misunderestimated person as a Secretary General. There are not many Secretary Generals who in the hustings, this time 10 years ago, actually stood up when John Bolton was behind him and in response to my question said, I completely believe in the International Criminal Court and I will do everything I can to operationalize it. So I thought at the time the guy is either terminally stupid or he's a leftover kamikaze pilot still wanted to crash on the deck, or he's a person of integrity, and I default on the latter one since then. No, we are too easy to dismiss these things. And the UN is so complex. Who is it? What is it? We've mentioned the contrast with the League of Nations. I actually did you must have done this as well. A lot of the UN Charter is basically the League of Nations rewritten with a veto added and a few other little odds and sods. Except the League of Nations had a great deal of respect for self-determination of peoples in a Wilsonian way, unless they were Germans or Hungarians or blacks and Africans and people like that. But they had a lot more respect for it. Whereas the difference in the United Nations was it was to deal with conflicts between states. It was invasions, conflicts between states and incursion of others that the UN has been dealing with. But I mean, I agree with you what it said. It's been almost like the British Constitution. It's infinitely malleable. Even though it stays the same, they can do things with it. You can invent peacekeeping. You can invent responsibility to protect. And you know, a lot of people, especially a lot of people in Aleppo at the moment, are obviously very upset with the responsibility to protect.
You can't say Aleppo.
What is at the bottom?
What?
The bottom.
Okay. There we go. Obviously not exactly ecstatic about the responsibility to protect, but it was one of the great steps forward, I think, in international law and international consciousness. And we have to realize that Kofi Annan seized the opportunity. He knew that you couldn't change the UN Charter. So basically, he got the whole of the world's statesmen in one place and got them to agree in reinterpreting the Charter. That a threat to peace actually meant people killing their own people inside their own territory. I mean, that's basically what he did. And, you know, a lot of us are disappointed, but looking at those of us at the time who've been following this are actually amazed by how much the concept has taken legs. When even the Russians are invoking it to justify their behavior in Georgia and Ukraine. Okay, it's honored much more in the breached in the observance, but at least it's honoured, and that's one of the points about the UN. Kofi said this as well, that it was its unique legitimising role, which was really important. Just think, all of those people in the Republican Party, they hated the UN so much, they were desperate to get UN legitimation for their invasion of Iraq. They kept trying to find substitutes. You know, they had the coalition of the dupe, the coalition of the willing, the coalition of the bribe, all sorts of stuff. But they wanted the UN to do it, and they couldn't. And that's why, you know, lots of people are wandering around the world, checking with their lawyers as well as their travel agents when they go, because they broke international law, and they know it. Tony Blair is a case in point, Henry Kissinger, another one. These things, there are hopes. So, what's the hope for the future? I mean, the problem is, I'm a bit of a iconoclast. I do not think the Security Council should be enlarged. I think that if it's on the verge of being too big to actually function effectively at the moment. I think it's absurd to talk about democracy in the Security Council when you have absolute dictatorship sitting on there. And the idea that you enhance democracy by doubling the number of permanent seats, it's a bit as though you went back to Britain and said, we're going to increase democracy in the House of Lords by doubling the number of hereditary peers. You might increase the number and the balance, but you're not increasing democracy under any circumstances. So, you know, there are solutions in the Security Council. It does have a problem of legitimacy. And part of that problem is the behavior of some of the permanent five. No, the US and Russia are both prone to invoke the UN when it suits them and to ignore it when it doesn't. And then they wonder why nobody else listens to them when they invoke the principle. And we let them get away with it. We always let them get away with it. Because it's amazing how the press in both places is incredibly partisan. We do not call our own rulers into question. You know, we're all being very, with sort of freedom of the press here. If you looked at the press consensus in the US and Britain over the Iraq war, there was probably more dissent in the Russian press. On average, I think. Probably more dissent in the Chinese press even. Everybody went along because they would lose their jobs if they didn't. Rupert Murdoch is no more gentle of dissent than is Vladimir Putin. Different source, you're not going to get locked up as a British or American journalist. You're not going to get disappeared or meet strange people with umbrellas pointing at you. But you're not going to advance in your career very well if you actually tell the truth too often. So, I mean, I think we have to have this comparison. We need the UN. The UN needs the United States. It needs the permanent members behind it. And that means it needs the citizens of those countries to ensure that they live up to their international responsibilities. And that's something the press has got to do, and point out when they don't. You know, for example, at the moment, Britain, my native country, is discussing Trident and rearmament. And it's being discussed in a framework that completely misses out Britain's obligations under the comprehensive, under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the UN Charter. It's not just stupid to spend billions of dollars on building submarines with nuclear-tipped missiles, it's actually illegal. It's breaching our treaty obligations in Britain. And even at the moment in the United States, it's weird that the candidates seem to be quiet about this. There's a huge movement to rearm the US and to retool with nuclear weapons, and that's against all of the agreements and treaties which we're preaching to others. We're turning to the Iranians, we're turning to the North Koreans and saying, no, you can't do that. And by the way, the next budget has got more than your sort of entire GDP for the next 50 years to build new missiles. It's our responsibility, if we support the UN, to call our own governments to account. And if you want, we don't want to get onto the Secretary General stuff at the moment, do we?
We'll leave it to the audience.
Okay, the sumo, the tag sumo wrestling match. Okay.